All righty. Welcome, everybody, to this video. This is part of the Kairos series for the Asian American Christian Collaborative. And today, I want to introduce several friends. Of course, I need to start by letting you know who I am. I'm Gabriel J Cuttanas, the Director of Ecclesial Advocacy, pastor in Chicago, and also finishing a PhD here in Chicago where I teach theology and ethics at a couple of schools nearby. So thank you for joining us. We're glad to have this conversation and that the AACC has made a space for Filipino Americans to join this conversation. And I have three friends, special friends with me today who have a wide range of experiences, but I want to start by letting them introduce themselves, what they're up to, where they are, and then we'll go from one person to the next person. So why don't we start with Denise? Denise Peñacerrada Kruse.
Yep.
Introduce yourself, especially telling us what you're doing for the AACC, and then whatever else you want to say.
Okay. I'm Denise Cruz. I live just outside of St. Louis, Missouri. I'm from Chicago. That's how I know Jay. And grew up there. And so I am an editor for the AACC. I just started, super excited about it. I am within my church. I'm on the worship team, and we have recently developed a sort of working out the name for it because we don't want to be another committee at another church, but it's a cultural engagement, basically council, I think, some sort of diversity situation, which is good because it's intentional. But so I'm doing that. I'm on the worship team there. I play the violin because I'm Asian and we're supposed to. And I'm married and I have three kids, 2, 5, and 7.
Awesome. And where are you right now, if you're allowed to tell us?
Right now I'm at the beach. Okay. I just feel like I'm rubbing it in now because everyone's at home.
That's great. Hey, you deserve to be out there if you've been in the pandemic with all these kids. So.
We're calling it our isocation.
Wow.
Cool. Nice. I like that.
I dig it. And you see why she's on the editorial team. So very cool. All right, let's go to David.
All right, my name is David Perez. Currently, I serve as the Director of Ministry with Young People at Irvine United Congregational Church in Irvine, California. I know Jay from the 14 years that I lived in Chicago, particularly in the suburbs of Bartlett, where I served 10 years as a Director of Youth Ministry at Good Shepherd United Methodist Church. Let's see, I'm married. I've got 2 kids. I got an 11-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy. We actually were just at the beach Saturday, so don't feel bad, Denise. Let's see. So I've, in my seasons of ministry, I've been able to navigate spaces, conservative spaces and progressive spaces, and just kind of figuring out what that looks like for me. I'm kind of finding that I'm a little too progressive for conservatives. I'm a little too conservative for progressives. And so trying to figure that out. And I've been in mostly white spaces. So, I think it's a unique kind of experience that I have. And, especially somebody who was actually born, in the Philippines, moved to Southern California when I was 10. And growing up in the Filipino church, in the Philippines, and being among Filipino community, for whatever reason, I had just ended up, in predominantly white churches. So figuring out, what that means, what my role will be. I'm part of the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force at my church, addressing some stuff. Although we are a progressive church, it appears that we have work to do when it comes to dismantling, white supremacy, even in progressive spaces. So, I think in a nutshell, that's me.
I like task force. I'm going with that.
Task force is good.
Yeah.
I mean, it implies that you're getting more things done than a committee.
Right.
Even it may not be true, but it sounds like it. Awesome. EJ.
EJ Ravago, pastor or church planner of New Abbey Covenant Church, which is 45 minutes north of Chicago in the city of Waukegan. It's a suburb, but we're an urban suburb, if that makes sense. We'll turn 4 years in September. And I know Jay through seminary. We met pretty late in the game, 2007. And then we've been pretty close friends since then. Been doing a lot of work together. Married almost 10 years. 3 kids, 7, 5, and 1. Pretty similar to Denise.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's it. That's me in a nutshell, trying to figure things out on the go as a church planner. So
Very cool. Very cool. No beach, though.
no, but, well, you know what? We had the Waukegan beach, but that's a little different than those West Coast California beaches. Just a tad different.
Yeah, a little bit. Awesome. Well, so because, Filipino Americans are different, we just got to represent by our own intro music. So I just want to play this. People know which group and conversation they're about to listen to.
Uh-oh.
All right?
Casey and JoJo. All right.
Amazing.
Okay, that's enough of that.
That's a Filipino theme song for everybody.
Yes.
That is Bebot by Black Eyed Peas. So maybe that's the first way we'll start, what is a Bebot? No, just kidding. Anyway, they can Google that. What I love about this group is that there is a wide range of experiences. And I think that I picked y'all to join me, not just because we're friends, but because we have a nice diversity of theological backgrounds and involvement in ministry. So I want to still help us get to know each other and help those who will watch and listen to this later on to get to know each of you. If you could just start by telling us a little bit more about your church background, specifically at its intersection with Filipino American identity and culture. So I'll go first just, to do that. But I grew up in a pretty old school conservative Baptist community. I am the 9th pastor in a family of lots of pastors and missionaries and ministry people. My father, my grandfather, my brother, many uncles, all are pastors. And so here I also am. But tracing back, I've been looking at the roots of the Baptist movement in the Philippines. And of course, they extend to, the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, when the United States, in a sense, took over the Philippines from the Spanish and then opened up the doors to American missionaries to come in. So this is one thing Denise and I have in common. Our parents went to a university in Iloilo City in the Philippines, which was actually founded by the first wave of Baptist missionaries from the United States. And that is a Baptist university in the Philippines, the first. And also they established the first nursing school in the Philippines.
Hey.
Huge implications for how we find ourselves now. And go figure, then my mom became a nurse, as did many of my aunts.
A Filipino nurse?
No way.
Bro.
So because of the Philippines connection, I'll pass it to Denise, who just tell us more about your theological religious background, but including how you moved from that Philippine connection to the U.S. connection.
Well, my mom went to college with J-Boy's mom. So she was, I think, 2 years younger or something like that. Class of 73, my mom. How about you, Jay?
71.
71, see? So they all came kind of in the same wave of nursing students coming over to settle eventually in Chicago. My mom made a couple stops before, but so she had grown up Catholic, and I think upon going to CPU, going to the college there, she did end up converting to Baptist. And so that sort of all fed into how I grew up, where I grew up very fundamental Baptist. It was a church basically down the street from where Jay's church was, where there was an actual Filipino community. But we were in a predominantly white fundamentalist Baptist church. And that was, I guess, just my first taste of Christianity, which made it very difficult as I got older to not only establish my identity as a Christian and a minority, but just my understanding of God in general within that movement was very harsh. And so Jay and I have had a lot of talks about that. And I feel like I'm way deviating from the question, but okay. It's been hard to navigate, quite honestly. And so coming into my 20s and then eventually getting engaged, getting married, we had decided that we were going to, my husband and I, who is white, we decided that we were going to have to figure out on our own, like which parts of how we were raised are going to factor into how we raise our children now. And so I think that my cultural identity and not only that, but my identity as a Christian has been widely shaped through my relationship with my husband and becoming a mother, because I didn't want them to go through the same identity issues that I did growing up. And that was very important to me, that I didn't want them to feel like outsiders. So we are currently in a very predominantly white church, but that's sort of where we are geographically. So I can't really help that without uprooting my entire family and our lives. But I do think that there is a stronger sense of cultural identity, or I at least hope that I'm bringing that to my family right now. And so that is, I guess, where we are. And somewhere in the middle of that, I guess I should add in, because it's going to come up later, my family and I moved down to Little Rock, Arkansas, and we lived there for 10 years. And so I had this whole like Filipino in Arkansas thing that was somehow even more foreign than being the only Filipino in a white church in Chicago thing, because at least I could step out of that church and see other people who looked like me. I moved to Arkansas and there was nobody. So that was a culture shock. And that is why I moved back to Chicago immediately after college. And J-Boy and I connected again. And that is where we are now.
Nice. Yeah. Wow. We have to talk about that some more, but thank you for raising that. Who wants to jump in?
David does.
Awesome.
Yeah, I resonate a lot with that journey in ways, because of how I've been in predominantly white churches since I moved to the United States, and kind of feeling displaced and wanting to assimilate but not really knowing how. I think the plan was always to move to the U.S. My siblings, who are much older than me, had already started way before me and started families here, and my parents and I were gonna follow eventually. But the whole people power movement kind of became a catalyst and kind of rushed us out of the Philippines in 1987. And so I found myself as a 10-year-old in Southern California, leaving a community that I have known all my life, grew up with, and it was a church that my family had helped plant in Malabon, and from what I know, you guys spoke about being influenced by Baptist missionaries in the Philippines, where we were influenced by United Methodist missionaries in the Philippines. And so I kind of learned that through my family history, that's where we found our roots in. And we ended up planning an independent community church in Malabon. And being Filipino in white churches, and almost gravitating towards white people, for whatever reason, I learned to kind of embrace the whole coconut mentality, brown on the outside, white on the inside. And I realized that was kind of problematic, just kind of thinking back, and I went on a journey, especially the last 5-6 years, deconstructing a lot of my upbringing. There has been some anti-blackness sentiment anti-black sentiment, within my family, and trying to, undo that, and thinking about, where I'm at, theologically, by no means am I seminary trained, but, because of my own, personal studies and mentoring, I'm landing on the more progressive side of the theological spectrum, which is very, very, very different. I'm not as far progressive as a lot of people, but at the same time, I think, if, with my family, if I make conversations about anything progressive, it's enough to make them feel uncomfortable, and so navigate, and trying to figure that out. I'm in the process of deconstructing and reconstructing and figuring that out, as a Filipino, landing in a more progressive side of Christianity. What does that mean? What does that mean when Filipinos tend to lean very heavy on the conservative side and even the moderate side? So that's kind of, my journey. I mean, I had left the church. I was in the Navy for 8 years, and probably in my entire Navy career, I wanted nothing to do, with the church. I was very disillusioned. I think part of that too was being, in a white church, feeling displaced. I lost that sense of community, and I've talked to people about, realizing that maybe churches nowadays, try to find intimacy without vulnerability. And,
yes.
I think looking for, and I think that's what we want. And I think for me, I found the intimacy and vulnerability, sometimes a little too much vulnerability in a Filipino community. But at the same time, it was there. And I think that's what I found missing. And then so there was no authenticity. And so I didn't want to be a part of that. Until, my wife and I moved back to Chicago. She's from Chicago. She's actually from Waukegan. And we moved back to Chicago, and that's where I reconnected with the community. It was, I think it was Rich Mullins that said, I'm a Christian not because somebody taught me the nuts and bolts of Christianity, but because people became the nuts and bolts of Christianity. And so that's kind of like the way I see it. Is, you can throw a lot of, doctrine at me, you can throw a lot of scripture at me, but if you are not the nuts and bolts of Christianity, then, I don't know if I can find that connection, with you. So I think for me, that's been, my journey, here and there, weaving in and out. So, yeah.
That's good. I dig that. Let's go to Mr. Vulnerable, Pastor EJ Ravago. He's a big crier, so I like to tease him about that.
Yeah, for you Myers-Briggs people, I am an ENFP, which means I just cry all the time. So, my story is complicated like everyone else's. I was born and baptized Catholic. My mom was a Catholic. My dad was a nominal UMC, which means Catholic David. But I was always conscious of God and the church, but we really weren't church people until I was 8, 9, or 10, around those times. My mom kind of entered into this like faith exploration where she wanted more answers. And so I remember going just to different churches for a few years with my mom trying to figure things out. So I was exposed to Mass, the Pentecostal church, the Lutheran church, the Adventist church, my mom just trying to figure all that stuff out. And then eventually our family and a couple other families started like an in-home Bible study, which was a church plan essentially. And it grew to, a sizable amount. And, they wanted to become an official church. And they found a pastor from the Philippines. He was a fundamentalist pastor, but there's a difference though. You guys, Denise and Jay, are fundamental Baptists. These guys were Bible Baptists, which is a whole different. Well, they're related, but even more conservative than your fundamental Baptists. So he was a Bible Baptist pastor, and I think most of my formation happened there. It was a Filipino independent fundamental Baptist with the Bible Baptist tradition all up in there. And so it had a lot of its ups and downs. I mean, the biggest piece was trying to figure out what is Filipino, what is Christian, and what is like this whole Southern culture in it. It was so bizarre, right? We're Filipinos being Baptist, but there's this whole Southern culture plopped on it, right? So, women couldn't wear pants. We had Filipinos in Waukegan speaking Victorian English. It was bizarre, right? With the whole King James thing. So, So through that, they started a Bible study in Skokie, which is just outside of Chicago. And that grew to like 80, 90 people. And instead of, requiring them to go all the way up to Waukegan, the church decided, this is its own separate church. And long story short, my dad ended up being the pastor of that church after he retired from the Navy. And so when that happened, I was like, man, what is going on? Like, I'm wrestling with my faith. I don't even know what this whole thing is. But there's a part of me that wanted to know more. And so I went to Bible college, this place called Maranatha Baptist University in the forests of Wisconsin. And even though that was like a fundamentalist Baptist college, there was a lot of formation there. For the first time, I felt like I understood the gospel, like I understood what grace was. So I came back, graduated, became an associate pastor under my dad for 5 years. And then I met Jay in seminary. But yeah, long story short, I think my journey at this point is really trying to untangle all my past history, or at least trying to sort it out to find out what really is Christian, what's Filipino, and all that stuff. So That's a long story short.
That's really good. One of the things that I have to acknowledge in this discussion is that all three of you are military families, or coming from military families. And that's a unique thing about Filipino Americans, but also Filipinos in the Philippines, given the relationship with the United States over history. And I want to come back to that, but I want to first turn to what EJ just raised with the word untangling or disentangling. I think the picture or the image of being tangled is a really, really helpful way for us to depict what Filipino American identity is, especially given the history of colonialism from the Spanish to the Americans, and then even in the United States, as I contend, under the banner of Asian Americanness, which can be in some ways less helpful rather than more helpful for understanding who we are as Filipino Americans. So I'm going to do something really weird, but ask this question to each of you, and then, answer whenever you want. But this moment that our country, the United States, is in, this country is having itself a real moment, right? And I don't want to say that history hasn't included many other too common instances of systemic racism and violence being surfaced the way they're surfaced again right now. But there is opportunity in front of us that has not perhaps been there, especially within the Christian community. So what I'm asking you is this: how have the recent events challenged you to disentangle or shed light on how tangled you are, or we are, as Filipino American Christians in a whole bunch of other mess? How are you experiencing this moment, and how does it relate to being tangled up? Anyone can kind of have at that.
Man, you ask big questions. You always do.
I can just play Bebot again, and that can get it real serious mode.
Play it for 2 more minutes.
Right.
And then we'll,
That can be like our Jeopardy song while we're thinking.
We just might start getting too distracted, though, us being Filipino.
Well, I know for me that the colonialism, I didn't realize how big of a factor that it played into so many aspects of my life. My parents and many of my cousins' parents also never taught us to speak their language because they wanted us to assimilate. And we never really talked about identity. We never really talked about how to handle if we ever did face discrimination, and we did. And if we ever brought it up with them, then it was mostly just like sweep it under the rug, ignore it. And it was never, let's address it and call it what it is, call it racism. And we need to act this way instead, or we need to expect this of people or help educate people. That was never spoken. And I think that it's just so easy to kind of crawl into that, like, I know, speaking for my family, we just really like having authority figures. We really like bowing to authority. So with my dad, who was the one who brought us into the fundamentalist church, he kind of needed the structure. I understood as I got older. Of course, I resented it when I was wearing culottes at the beach, but like it was what it was, And the more I understood about his background, his life, how he had kind of had this big trauma, like not traumatic, but tumultuous adolescence, childhood. He was, the black sheep in a way, and he needed structure that the fundamentalist church provided. And by that, it meant for him, at least, surrendering his entire identity. And our church, especially our church in Arkansas, it was, I think on the sign it says independent, fundamental, Bible-believing, like King James Version on the sign outside the church. And he leaned in hard. He got some cowboy boots. He just had this big belt buckle, like, Dad, you're Filipino. But he was just like, this is my Jesus wears a cowboy hat, apparently. And so for me, seeing all of that just coming flooding back, especially during recent events, I'm realizing how deep it runs and how difficult it is to have these conversations. Yes, especially with people in my family, and even with people in my own generation in our family, which has been surprising for me because I'm thinking we have all this information open to us now. We can read, we can learn. It's okay to change your mind, change direction, to just open your mind to other things. And so I know that I grew up very conservative and and that it was a struggle learning. It was a struggle seeing the cracks. I really wanted to believe that the foundation that I had built myself, that I guess specifically I should point out that I built around myself, like I wasn't truly rooting it in the gospel or in like my identity was so shaky and I had no idea. But when I saw the foundation crumbling and it's like, oh, goodness, I have nothing to stand on now. Like it's hard to see that playing out in the world, but also rebuilding it now and kind of learning more, establishing identity. That has been so helpful in just like, I'm confident now when I speak. I don't just like spout opinions to start fights. I know what I'm talking about, which is brand new feeling for me, but it's just kidding. But I just know that the figuring out how the colonialism plays into the conversations that we're having now with different Filipino Americans has been very painful, I think, for me to see and take note of.
Yeah, that's good. That reminded me of something David and I were talking about, which kicked up a lot of our communication to make it more frequent. Can you say a little bit, David, about how you started talking to your family about a lot of the anti-blackness that you were discovering, which for all of us, given the roots that we've shared, this is a thing, but what has that been like for you and your conversations with family, David?
Well, for me, it hasn't been very many. I've got a couple of nieces and a nephew out here in California that's been very, pretty visible and pretty vocal about Black Lives Matter and racial justice. And when I saw them like really being super active on social media, in my mind I was like, okay, let me kind of reel them in, not to prevent their voices to be out there, but at the same time, kind of temper that a little bit, and knowing that too much can end up just being noise. And how can we, and plus it can be, exhausting, trying to engage people, and how can we rally together, and just, a place of like soul care. So we have this group text that we kind of check in on each other about the conversations that we're having. Like my niece is having conversations with her parents, and she kind of checks in, just like, oh my gosh, she's had a conversation with my dad. It was so frustrating. Her dad works in the as a correctional officer, and so it was difficult for her to to really engage in that. And for me, the entanglement, I think kind of surfaced, in 2016. I think in especially being part of the United Methodist Church at the time. The United Methodist Church actually has social principles that they develop, addressing justice issues. And so I learned, and so there are a lot of things that hadn't sat well with me over the years, even prior to 2016. But because it didn't directly affect me or those around me at the time, I kind of just sat on it. I saw certain things happening, in the media, but it was one of those things where, it didn't really directly affect me. And so, I kind of, played into my own privilege in that way, but when 2016 happened, and I saw a little bit more in it, and it started hitting a little closer to home, I decided, just like, wait a minute. I need to learn a little bit more, right? And that's when I started unraveling some stuff, and that whole adage where you pull on a piece of string, you start kind of pulling at it and pulling at it and pulling at it, and I think the recent events and the recent unrest just kind of sparked the urgency. I think I kind of started becoming a little bit more complacent again, but recent events sparked more urgency, and which is why I'm finding ways here and there to kind of if I see something, like I'm in a family group text, if I see something remotely, I kind of like watch certain things. You start scrolling and you're like, all right, where are they going with this? Where are they going with this? And then and then I'll just do simple stuff where I was like, oh, and it's cool because sometimes my nieces or my nephews would step in, with a lot more grace than I would have. So it's just that, I think it's, for me, it's gathering, members of my family that, that are feeling that conviction, and figuring out ways not just to, not to let this be, a way to kind of, push like a message down people's throats, because in a way, I'm sure you guys, might resonate with this. Growing up, that's almost what we experience, the whole lecturing and don't do this, don't do that, and so, obviously it's not effective, but finding ways, and then finding ways to also say, you know what, I can't have a conversation with that person. I can't, and that's okay for now. Maybe if it comes up, I can engage, but it's one of those things. If somebody's bent, towards, misunderstanding you, there's no way, so I think, for me, that's where I, where I stand. I think for me, the spark was in 2016 when, we know what happened in 2016, and just recent events, and knowing more people that have been affected, in a way, it's sad to say that it's taking that, to spark that sense of urgency, which is probably why I kind of jumped towards, I was with the UMC for a long time. And then I jumped towards the UCC, which is like completely like, all the way progressive. Maybe that's the reason why I kind of like, well, let's see if I can make a bigger difference as, with the more progressive church. And I'm seeing, I was like, maybe that's not the case, so I'm kind of wrestling with that, right. Because, I learned, recently that, some approaches, especially, especially non-Christians approach to racial justice is, tackling and dismantling systems, right? Whereas, somebody who is a Christian, they tackle the individual contribution, the sin of racism, and for me, progressive churches is, are kind of approaching it in a more systems approach, and kind of neglecting the whole. Well, as individuals, we contribute to it, and which is why a lot of progressives dismiss the whole. Derek Chauvin, was was an evil person. I was like, yeah, but it's the police system, blah blah blah, and so they forget that can go hand in hand, and trying to figure out how do we communicate that. It's not and or, like it's both and. As followers of Jesus, I look at Jesus like he addressed individual sin, but he also addressed the system. He also addressed what was in place, and worked to dismantle that. So but yeah, so I think that's what is serving as a catalyst. I think it's just things hadn't sat right with me, and as I started seeing events affecting people that I know more and more, it's causing me to wait, I need to find ways to do something.
David, speaking to what you were saying about conversations with your family, I know that part of what has sparked me to continue to have these conversations is kind of a wider understanding of grace. And I think that what we're hearing a lot is give people grace, which from where I sit, it sounds like make excuses for people to continue to say hateful things, but give them grace because you need to know where their hearts are from. On both ends of the spectrum, to continue to say hateful things. And I remember hearing my pastor at church talking about refining grace and how it conjures up images of, refinement. It's, just upper class society, but refining in silver work is literally putting things in fire and putting the silver in fire to take away all the impurities from it. And these conversations need to be full of refining grace. And refining grace is super uncomfortable. You're in a fire, but through that, all the impurities, all of the prejudices, all of the ugliness, everything that we hold in our heart that we're not acknowledging is coming to the surface, and we're able to help one another process through that. And I think, I know that's what's difficult, because nobody wants to have difficult conversations. We just want to be full of grace and have that be some sort of fairy dust thing that we sprinkle on our lives in Christianity. But grace is hard. Grace is something that is going to change us, or should. And I think that is what is missing from a lot of conversations, is we need to be able to be refined, and refining hurts.
I think about the parable of the weeds, right? Maybe part of our growth, here is that we grew up, entangled with weeds, but in the parable, Jesus said, no, don't separate them yet, because you might damage the actual, crop that you want. Just let it grow, and then we'll just separate. So maybe it's that time. Maybe it's because we experienced the growth that we needed to grow, and for me, maybe that's why. And then that's where the refinement comes, the separation of the weeds, from what's good.
Yeah, that's good.
In 2016, we planted, and we probably had 10 months to prepare for the actual launch. And, a big theme for planning New Abbey was, let's really see what this whole multi-ethnicity thing looks like. And so that was a big topic for us. And then I'm not sure if you guys remember, in July, the whole Anton Sterling and Philando Castile happened, when they both got shot to death by the police. And so that just reminded our church the importance of multi-ethnicity, not as the goal, but as a means for, love and just being reconciled to one another. And then 2016 election happened. And so another factor that really shaped our ethos as a church to really just wrestle with some of the on the ground issues of what it means to be brown or yellow and black in not just in the country, but in the church. And so unfortunately, the George Floyd thing is nothing new, right? And but I feel like this time around, it's really forcing maybe even the Filipino church to consider how race and our national histories really inform how we do ministry. and how we think about the gospel. And that's where I've been kind of wrestling with now. Like, one group that we had to constantly interface with is the first gen, right? I mean, it's not a secret that the first gen and the second gen just view things very differently. But I think to be faithful people in solidarity with first gen, we always have to be attached to them. And I think our job is to show how our stories really parallel the Black story. And because of Black plight, we're here in the first place. So, I mean, that's how I've been trying to process all this, really trying to make the Black and white issue related to our issue. And that's always been met with difficulty because, I grew up in a church where half of them were Navy guys, right? And, we're all military family. And, as on top of that, we're immigrants. And so we get kind of co-opted into the big national narrative of whiteness. And in the 80s, the whole moral majority thing was hot. And so it was assumed that being Republican and conservative was the Christian way. And so those were the things that I'm learning to disentangle from my identity and my theology. And it's difficult. And in many ways, it's sad, as we just kind of scan the entire Filipino American church, because you see a lot of the deficiencies in how they view the gospel and ministry, which is, again, a larger thing for the whole entire evangelical church in the first place, right? We've, truncated the gospel to a ticket to heaven. And, the Filipinos have taken that on. And, my job as a church planner, a luxury for me as a church planner is I don't have to be careful in navigating the cultural taboos because I'm creating culture essentially, right? And so yeah, I'm just going straight at it, and saying the gospel has hands and feet. It's earthy. The gospel means something right now, and for a lot of Filipinos, that's new because our gospel has been co-opted with whiteness, and so I think by being Filipino, we got to tell them, man, it's communal as well, right? And it has actual earthly effects. So that's my project now as the lead pastor of my church and as a son of a first gen guy, just to have those conversations and how the gospel looks a little bit different than what we first assumed in our faith formation. So
that's really good. I want to push on this some more. I think the ways that I want to hear more about the experiences that we are having within our own churches as we work through some of these real difficult situations and issues. I'm thinking in my own experience, a lot of these things go back real far, maybe even to college, getting involved with Asian American activism. And then, 2015, getting involved with the demonstrations with Black churches and Black lives at that time around the video that was released by force, of course, of the shooting of Laquan McDonald at the hands of white police officers. And then 2016, of course, like y'all are mentioning. But I did come to a place personally where I could no longer faithfully live out my convictions about following Jesus in the area of racial justice within that church where I was. And so I paid a huge cost, and I do view myself as still paying that cost. You hear and see things that are said about you in social media and through rumors. And in the Filipino context, there's this chismis, right? Gossip. And so it has been not just like a theological struggle, but this is a highly personal struggle. And one of our cultural values is, pakikisama, right? Smooth interpersonal relations. So anytime you rub up against the elders in conflict and against the parental figures who you don't just call them, by first names either. You call them uncle or auntie, tito or tita, and everybody who's older than you has a title, right? I want to talk about what are the experiences that you're having in your context as you work for racial justice? It's not just the unentangling, but this is you're trying to also go somewhere and lead people somewhere and push. Denise, you've had some success in the terms of helping your church leaders think through this. Can you share about that?
Sure. One of my very good friends at church, she is Puerto Rican. She's the daughter of missionaries to Puerto Rico as well. And we just came together to lead a college girls Bible study. And in doing that, we have become more, I guess, more not aware of our cultures, like we forgot what we were, but just learning about one another and finally acknowledging the two of us saying our church has not done anything. And Jay, I know that you started your activism, 5-6 years ago. And I remember learning a lot through what our conversations and articles that you had written and different resources that you had provided. And I remember thinking back then, like, this seems like this is the church's job. Like, the church did not step up during civil rights. The church did not step up when they were accepting tithes from slave owners before the Civil War. The church has to step up now, or what are we doing? Like, we are just creating a culture that is basically hostile to people who are not, I know in my area specifically, white, conservative, Christian. And so that was very difficult for me to swallow. And it just felt like it was coming to a time where something had to be said. And I know that pastors get so much flack and so many emails and so many people trying to, oh, I think that you should have approached it this way. And maybe you should go to seminary and you should get your own church. And I get that. But I also think that for a lot of pastors in white churches, they don't see that. They don't see what's happening. They see what's happening, obviously, because they're fairly informed of current events, but they don't see what is happening in identity and how far back that goes, how far back that thread goes. And again, how entangled the church is in all of it. And it was very important to me that my church begin to take a stand. My friend and I actually scheduled a meeting with one of our pastors to talk about this. And it was that week that everything happened, that we walked in, we were like, look, a man was just killed at the hands of police officers lying on the ground. And our church has still not said anything about Ahmaud Arbery. We have not said anything about Breonna Taylor. We have not said anything. And we need to. Like, our pastor had said something on his social media, which was a big deal, and which he did get interesting feedback on. But as a church, we weren't releasing anything. We weren't, like, our sermon series was going on as scheduled. And I was heartbroken. I was like, this sounds tone deaf. This is beginning to feel like I am being alienated because these are matters that pertain not just to me personally. I'm not going to ask the church to attack everything that I care about, but to the gospel. Like, how are we showing that we care about the eternal state of people of color if we can't care about them now? And I just kind of took a stand on that. And that was when the ball started rolling, and I got a lot more staff support, had it brought up at staff. We have a pretty big church staff, like 22 people or something. It's a pretty big church. But it was brought up at the staff meeting the following week. And from there, it just like really skyrocketed. I was sincerely a little shocked at how quickly everything came together. But we had a 4-part race and responsibility series about how social justice and racial equity tie into the gospel, and how it is the church's job moving forward, and how every single person needs to examine their personal biases and, again, refine those out of their hearts. And we are having a series of race panels. We met with a woman at another local church who is the diversity and inclusion director. I feel like I got that wrong, but she definitely encouraged us. And she said this to me and I think 4 other people on staff. This cannot be a side ministry. This has to be something that is part of your church's identity if you truly want to make an impact. And so I feel like we're still at very beginning stages, and that there's a lot of hearts that still need to be changed. My pastor got a lot I don't know what to call it except for hate mail over things that he was saying. And I know that when I ran into him, we were still having virtual church, but I was up helping with something, and I ran into him and he seemed very discouraged and like he had been just through the ringer that week. And I was like, man, there is like a big contingency of us who are behind you 100%. And we will be more vocal to encourage you, because this is what needs to be happening right now. This is what needed to happen in the church 400 years ago. Like, nobody should have ever stood for racialization in this way, especially not the church. And so seeing those small successes along the way, I know that we're just at the beginning, and I still have very hard conversations with friends where I'm like, that's actually not okay to say. And I know that makes you uncomfortable, but like that, I don't like that. And I don't want you saying that. And this is what that says to me. And it makes me feel like some sort of alien creature. And I know I'm not. And, so it's incremental steps, it's baby steps. And I'm trying very hard to like be patient, because it's taken the church this far to get this far, or this long to get this far. But seeing that happen in my predominantly white church, from what I know in the St. Louis area, as far as big churches go that are predominantly Caucasian, like my church was one of a handful that said anything specifically about just the social climate right now. And so that was very impactful for me.
You said you're outside of St. Louis?
Mm-hmm.
Right. A good friend of mine was on staff at a church down there, and it reminded, a lot of what you're saying reminded me of just responses. He was on staff at Church on the Rock. I don't know if you know.
Oh, I know that.
Yeah. And he's Black. His wife is Puerto Rican, and we're part of this like group text. And he would kind of like share stuff. I was like, oh my gosh, somebody from my church just posted this, and just things like that. And so yeah, I can definitely kind of connect based on what other people have said when it comes to that area. I mean, for me, and I told Jay this, that because I've had the privilege of working in conservative spaces and progressive spaces, I've come to learn that in conservative spaces, people of color tend to get alienated, and whereas in progressive spaces, people of color end up getting tokenized. So it's how do we find a place where we are we can just be celebrated. It's like it seems as if like whenever I'm if my family or myself are in a progressive Christian space, it's like I was like, hey, these are the Perez's. They're our Filipino family. I was like, okay, can we just be like one of the families? You know what I mean? So it's it's that. Especially now, like one of the reasons why I was hired was they do want to be intentional in having a diverse staff as far as like leadership. But at the same time, I don't think this church has ever had a person of color in the actual pastoral leadership as a lead pastor. We just recently we're Temper, who's a woman, but however she's white. It's great we have a woman pastor that it creates that that diversity in that sense. But at the same time, there was, and I think that's the reason why our diversity and inclusion task force, started, was because let's take a look at our hiring practices. I mean, it may not be explicitly, racist, but at the same time, what are we doing in, addressing like real diversity, within our church, and I think about, just progressive churches and churches that lean progressive, the UMC, the UCC, the Episcopalian Church, they are very high church, very liturgical. And, but at the same time,
is that, I mean, what does that reflect? You know, I mean, and we're, does that reflect, like, you know, my culture? Like, and like for me, yes, I grew up in hymns. Yes, but at the same time, that whole culture, where does that come from? You know, does that come from, you know, colonialism? You know, where does that come from? And so, for me, that's what I'm trying to figure out. You know, what's my voice? You know, is my voice going to be taken seriously, or am I just like the token voice? You know, within within our will my voice be heard initially, and then if I start, you know, like I said, I might end up being too conservative for a progressive group. You know, when I start saying things, and, you know, right now our interim pastor has been really great, you know, and I told him, you know, some of the, you know, cause I don't preach, yet, you know, in our virtual stuff, but I do, you know, share kind of like, it's like the children's message, but almost like the pregame of the sermon, you know, so you know, I share, you know, a little bit and he noticed that I had a change in tone. You know, at some point I was like, what happened? I was like, it sounds like you kind of found your voice a little bit. I was like, well, you know, to be honest with you, I've been kind of tiptoeing, you know, because, you know, I wasn't sure where I would land. You know, I was like, you know, not everybody knows where I'm coming from. You know, I told him, he's like, I know that I bring a little bit more a conservative or moderate flavor to a place that's very progressive. You know, and he kind of like he's like, stop right there. That's why we hired you. You know, and he's like, you know, he explained to me, you know, he considers himself as somebody who has high Christology, and talking about Jesus and the gospel in that progressive church kind of makes people uncomfortable, because there are a lot of people there. I mean, he called it more of like a refugee camp, hospital, where there's a lot of people there that experience church hurt. You know, and so there's a lot of people that are healing from that. You know, but at the same time, we talked about, hey, you don't stay in a hospital forever, right? You know, at some point you get better, or you work towards a plan to get better, right? You know, and then so I think that's what I was brought on for, to help kind of, you know, it's like, you know, he led the series, a discussion series and the sermon series on Paul, right? And Paul is kind of like a very controversial person, you know, in progressive spaces, and you know, and so his series is called Redeeming Paul. So, you know, so that's where I'm at, you know, like, how do I, and there's a lot of people there that, you know, are I guess it's professing agnostics, you know, that, you know, but at the same time, you know, I said, we are the most progressive denomination out there probably, but it's the United Church of Christ. Like, we still have Christ in our denomination. Like, what are we doing with that? You know, are we, you know, like for me, fine. I was like, you can come to, you know, whatever I have to do, you know, if I'm speaking somewhere, if I'm leading a series or whatever, you can come with whatever viewpoint that you have, perspective that you have, but I will unapologetically lead a discussion or speak on, you know, on something that is faith informed, and it's studied based on what I read from Scripture. You know, so that's the lens that I'm going to be teaching through, and it might make people uncomfortable. You know, because that's where I kind of bring it back to whenever we have diversity and inclusion, like gatherings and meetings and stuff. I kind of bring it back to that, like, what, you know, how do we look at it from the lens of Scripture? Great, you know, we have all these resources. We got very, very, like, super educated people in our congregation, you know, former clergy, you know, lawyers, you know, like very, like, over my head, like, type of people, you know, but at the same time, which is intimidating, right? You know, but at the same time, I was like, wait, I'm like, I can still bring something to the table, but at the same time, you know, how long are they going to hear me for, right? You know, am I gonna, you know, like, I guess my insecurity comes as like, am I going to be seen as, you know, not so credible because, you know, I don't have a seminary degree, you know, I'm still working towards, you know, grinding out with, you know, with my bachelor's, you know, so is the ministry for with young people here kind of like a novelty. It's like something, hey, we're a church, we should have a youth ministry here. Is it a novelty, or am I supposed to lead, young people to be a part of the church and its mission? And, what is, our church's mission? So just finding my role, when it comes to that.
Oh, that's really good. It makes me think a lot about the challenge for many of us. Would you rather be the person who's pushing a group in one direction or the other? You're a little too liberal for the conservative folk and you're pushing in that way, or the other way around where you're a little too conservative for some liberal folk. And then the struggle to really find home. But you touched on liturgy. So I actually wanted to pick on EJ a little bit because he's desired to incorporate that in his church plant, where we do have, I'm also a church planter. You get some freedom to shape culture from the very beginning of the church. But, as a person of color in a church that's mostly a church of color, but still, engaged liturgically, can you say more about that, EJ, and how can that be a vehicle for racial justice as well? Because I want to start talking about constructive suggestions that we can bring as Filipino Americans for racial justice.
Yeah. David, we're still friends, right? I want to affirm that response to liturgy as totally legitimate, but there's an other side too that I think is totally appropriate as well. So for me, I think being Filipino and being non-white necessarily points us to liturgy, because, before the Americans came, we were a liturgized people. And when the Americans came with their Protestantism, they're like, nope, don't do that, do this. So they replaced all our forms with other white forms. And so with the Filipino church being default anti-Catholic, I think we threw away some of these forms that are actually beautiful and beneficial, written prayers, Eucharist, all that stuff. And so, with the flexibility of being a church planner, I've learned to love some of that stuff, and I've incorporated, to the untrained eye as, Catholic things in our church. And so for your standard evangelical, we might as well be Catholic, but for your Catholic, we might as well be Pentecostal, right? So, I mean, depending where you are on the spectrum, on different things. But yeah, I think there is a redemptive quality to liturgy, especially for ethnic formation, because liturgy connects Filipinos globally, because, a Filipino Catholic could go to Japan, could go to China, could go to the Bay Area, to go to Chicago, go to a Filipino mass and experience the same thing. And there's something beautiful about that speaks to, Filipino ethnicity as well as this larger church. And so me as an evangelical, I want to tap into that spirituality and consciousness. And so this past year, 2019 Christmas, for the first time, we did Simbang Gabi, which is Filipino Catholic.
Can you explain that?
Sorry. So Simbang Gabi for non-Filipinos is 9 days before Christmas. We just do either early morning or late night mass for those historically who were farmers, right? So that they had to get their church in or communion in before they went out to work. So the tradition now is just late night service leading up to Christmas, and it'll be a small short homily, and then it ends off with eating babinka and other Filipino foods. So we did that this year as a Protestant evangelical congregation, but we had a few Catholic visitors, which was amazing to me, and there's enough familiarity where they felt comfortable in our service. And so I think liturgy transcends both Protestant and evangelical and space. And so I think there is a trans-cultural piece about liturgy that I want to tap into. So
it's interesting.
Yeah, we're still friends, dude. I mean, no, don't get me wrong, because I mean, as being part of the UMC, you kind of joke it's basically because there are a lot of liturgy that's borrowed from the Catholic Church, and there is beauty behind it. And for me, that was when I had started having conversations with Catholics, in my time in my seasons in youth ministry, I started to learn more about the beauty behind, the liturgy and the reasons behind it. And then so when I learned that, I was like, oh,
yeah,
now I get it, right? And then so I absolutely find the beauty. Like for me, I think that's for me I guess the byproduct of where I'm at is that suspiciousness, right? I'm suspicious. Yeah. Okay, like coming in and it feels very Anglo, right? And then so I'm like, I'm okay with it, but how are other people gonna feel? Like, are we really intentional with, does all mean all when people come in here that's different from what they're used to? And will they feel that? Will they feel like, oh yeah, this church means that they really do welcome all? So.
EJ, I have talked so much about how I feel like so much cultural identity was stripped from Filipinos when the American missionaries came in. And it was like, well, you have to adapt the entirety of our traditions. And what you're doing, even though it's like a homily and a meal before Christmas, that is now a pagan practice because it's not what we do. And I just find that so interesting because I am still learning. I mean, Jay and I used to run into people all the time in Chicago who just could not believe that there were two Filipino kids who had grown up Baptist at the same party. Like, we got yelled at by one dude. He was like, "You're lying." We were like, "No, man." So I know for me, there's so much I have to learn about my own culture. And not just because my parents shuffled us down to Arkansas for 10 years, but because there was so much that was taken away. And I listened to a podcast. I wish I could remember who it was. I know it was an Asian American pastor, but it was almost a decade ago that I heard this. And he was saying something about like how being Asian and being a Christian does not have to be mutually exclusive. Like, you don't have to surrender your culture while you surrender your life, And I just thought that was so amazing. Like, there's so many practices that we've just stopped doing because the American church doesn't do it. And so, I mean, even I watched Coco with my kids and cried hysterically. I was just like, this is beautiful. Why don't we do this? The whole Philippines does. Why don't we honor the people who have died? And I really like that idea of bringing in, just even through liturgical practices and traditions, just that heritage into your faith.
Really good. Really good. So you touched on a podcast or something that you've heard 10 years ago. And I wanted to start to push us in this specifically Filipino American contribution to the church's work in racial justice, right? So now you don't have to agree with me, but I want to, just probe with you. I find that it is often less helpful rather than more helpful to identify as Asian American. I do identify here and there, depending on the situation, as that. But in general, my primary frame or ethnic formation really has become Filipino American. But I grew up first adopting the Asian American moniker and identity, because I was in the suburbs of Chicago. This is the 80s and the 90s. There weren't enough Filipinos for me to understand what the heck that was, except at church. So in church, I was Filipino, but at school and on the sports fields, I was
when
Asian.
You were breakdancing.
What's that?
And when you were breakdancing.
Yeah, well, that one could go either way, actually. Yeah, so real quick, with you all, I just want to probe, and we'll make quick answers, but do you or have you identified with Asian American? And if so, why or why not? And we could just, any of you can go first.
I'll go first. I'll be straight up raw. Coming up, I always rejected internally that label of Asian American. I've never identified as Asian American. Growing up, the town I was in, and David knows, Gurnee, at that time it was 90% white. And so I knew I was different. And then when you go to school, you realize, oh wait, you're Asian American. And what people meant by that was totally way different than our experience as Filipino Americans. And so since day one, I found out about what an Asian was. I was like, that's not me, because culturally, I think there's a lot of overlap with Latino culture, but even for Latinos, we're not Latino enough, right? So, anyways, that's a whole different story. But yeah, as far as Asian American, I had a hard time identifying with the label, and so now I'm more comfortable with just saying I'm Filipino. Yeah. Even in the church setting, Asian American theology, it's like that's the Chinese and Korean mostly, and but yeah, that's a short of it. Oh, I'm interested with the other two.
Yeah, me too. Go ahead, y'all.
I mean, I never identified it as Asian American, and I barely identified as Filipino American. I tried to fit in so much that I would be shocked when I saw pictures of myself with my friends. I was like, I am brown. Check that out. But I always kind of felt like I was like kind of without a home. I didn't feel like I fit in with the Filipinos. I certainly didn't fit in with like the mainland Asians. I feel like we don't really belong in that space for some reason. And I've never been able to pinpoint that. Like, I don't know if I do that to myself because I like just some sort of inferiority thing, but I really have never identified with the whole Asian American body very much at all.
This is helpful. David, how about you?
Well, I mean, growing up in Southern California, I went to school with a lot of other Asians. So I think for me, it was almost necessary to identify as Filipino, to kind of set myself, apart. And it wasn't because I didn't want to identify with them, but it's just, it was just a thing, hey, I'm Filipino. It wasn't until probably when I was in the military that, in a way, I was kind of introduced to the idea of, Asian Americans just in general. It's kind of like a blanket thing, and I adopted it for convenience because I just didn't want to bother with like having to explain that I'm Filipino and, what the differences are. It's almost as if like, yeah, I'm Asian, and for those people that understand and know, I was like, oh, but are you like Korean? Or I was like, I'm Filipino. I was like, oh, okay. But for
my
me,
last name's Perez.
Yeah. And that I experienced some, and looking back, there were some microaggressions, in the Navy. Like I remember this dude, back then I used to smoke, and and when I was smoking with a bunch of guys, and some dude would like spout off like Mexican food randomly to me, and I'm like, what's this guy talking about? And then finally he heard me say some Tagalog stuff to one of our chiefs, and he was like, how do you know that language? And I'm like, because I'm Filipino. And he was like, oh, I swear you were like Mexican. I was like, dude, your name is Perez on your name tag. And I'm like, yeah, it's a long story. Yeah, it's a long story. And then so, every day I would hear like him singing Secret Asian Man. I thought he was Mexican, so I'm like, at first it was like funny, but like looking back, I was like, man, that was kind of problematic. And I think that goes with, what Denise was saying, you just kind of want to blend in and assimilate and not offend. But yeah, I mean, for me, I think I find myself now, because I think, I'm going to be, I'm going to be 44 next month. And so I think when I hit 40, I think that was like my threshold where like, I don't have a threshold for like BS anymore, so I'm just kind of like, I was like, I'm Filipino, and like unapologetically, like I don't want to say Asian as far as like, for convenience.
Yeah. So I think it's part of the journey. So there's that. It's ethnic identity formation and development. But we code switch a lot. And there's an added layer for us of that switching that other people may not have to go through, whether it's like a double or triple consciousness or something further than that. Okay, so I've been waiting for this. But what do you think then, as Filipino Americans who are Christian, as Christians who are Filipino American, might be your or our unique contributions to the work of the church for racial justice? Any of y'all can go first, and I'll probably just like go last or something.
I mean, I'm kind of like, and I think I mentioned this to Jay already, but it's on the same along the same lines as what EJ is already doing, right? Like for me, my experience as a Filipino and my understanding of of our culture, I look at the things that we enjoy doing and how we organically cultivate, community. We like to gather, right? We like to be with each other, and we like to eat, right? And so, what if I use that, that I guess you can say characteristic, of our culture and create spaces like that, where, because, if you look in the Bible, there are so many things that happen at the table, where people break bread. And I think that's why, Filipinos like to gather and like to gather around food, because there is, it's like, there are very few things more intimate than putting food in your mouth, right? Because it's like, you got to know that it doesn't poison you, right? And so, and the Bible says, taste and see. So there's all these things that come with, with the whole analogy of food and gathering, and so, a concept that I'm trying to like develop based on not just my youth ministry experience, but, I went to a dinner church training, at my last church. And I love that idea of having a gathering where you set up tables, you set up, just a food, food station, people come, somebody guides a conversation, music is playing, and there's no pressure. Like there's no, you can bring whatever type of format you want. I saw examples of people bringing in a visual artist. So while somebody is leading a conversation or speaking, somebody is kind of drawing something, and then somebody else is kind of playing instrumental music. So something like that, something very organic. I was joking. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I've been joking around with some people. I was like, do I just quit, the church as an institution at some point, and maybe, do like a house kind of church gathering, just like be a tent maker, right? Just get a regular job and just be, a tent maker and use that as a way to provide a space. So I think for me, that could be, a Filipino contribution using, what I grew up with. I grew up gathering with people. I grew up around tables, and, even at those gatherings, you have these like tables of like cousins and uncles, and, uncles, their own chismes with beer and, and mahjong, right? So it's like you see those happening, so why can't we have it, in a space, that creates, faith discussions and faith formation.
I like it. Says the DJ, whose turntables, other kind of tables, whose turntables we could see in the background. But yeah, we're very much a celebratory culture, but around the table and with food for the sake of family. I dig it. Yeah. What else? What might be some Filipino American Christian contributions to the church's work for racial justice?
I think multi-ethnicity is a kingdom value. And I know we have to be careful with what we mean by that. I know there's discussion on whether that needs to happen, inside the church or just inter-church connectedness and all that. But I do still think it's in some form, it's a kingdom value. And I think at this moment, especially, I think the Filipinos could serve as being bridges to a lot of different groups, with our mixed cultural and historical heritage, with, Spanish and American and then Asian, right? I think we could bridge a lot of different groups together that other groups cannot. And I think we got to utilize that mixedness, the hollowness about our culture, right? I don't think there's a lot of, the beans and the ice cream and all that. I don't think that there's a lot of intersection between, Asian communities and Latino communities. But if you throw a Filipino mix in there, I think, Filipinos could bring those two, especially those two communities together. So, I mean, that's the short of it. I think there's a lot of, reconciliation that could happen through our ethnicity. So that's how I see it.
That's good. I was going to say, I have no idea how Filipinos as a whole can contribute to this, but I know for myself individually, it looks a lot like what you're saying. And also with food, obviously, David, but like I speak spaces and sort of bring people together like that. And I know that it's become a very weird, not weird, it's a random, I guess, platform that has just come up with my social media posts, conversations I'm having, but I'm connecting with people that I've grown up with back in Schaumburg. And so I was a kid, like I was under 12, and they are sending me screenshots of social media posts, and they're like, hey, so my initial reaction to this is to feel offended and defensive. Can you give me any sort of insight to what maybe like the background of this sentiment is? Because I know that what I'm reading is not all of it. And I have been surprised that I've been able to actually help people navigate these discussions. And so I think that is definitely like bridging different groups together is a huge role that Filipinos can play in this.
Yeah, that's great. I see that in my work as well here in Chicago. We do have partnerships with churches that are not diverse, but if we could bring them all together, it would be very diverse. And my church is only 60% Filipino American, so does that qualify as a Filipino church? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, maybe by the fact that I'm leading it, it is. But, the second biggest ethnic group is our Mexican Americans. The second most frequently spoken language besides English and Filipino. So it'd be the third most spoken would be Spanish in our church. And so, and we have Asian Americans, obviously. So that is a lot of what you all are talking about. I'm thinking about us as a group and how diasporized we are as well, right? We're just so spread out in many ways, theologically, politically, socially, geographically. Maybe the thing that is really interesting for me to observe about us is the starting points that we have. We got two folks whose families kind of start as Catholic and then Methodist. And then obviously, if you go back far enough, we all start as Catholic. And then before that, we're indigenous and local spirituality. But Denise and I also have these Baptist roots. And, for those who are listening and may not know this, the Philippines was divided up into territories by the U.S. missionaries in what was called the Comity Agreement. Not comedy like funny, but comity. The Comity Agreement, where they said, this will be your territory as Methodists up in Luzon and up north, and then down in the central part would be where the Baptists decided to be. And then they spliced and diced according to denominations which territories they would take over so that they wouldn't compete with each other, but work instead in comity or with comity and get along as they evangelize the Philippines. So our starting points are what they are for a reason as well. And I think that has shaped a lot of our differences here. But, nonetheless, we're still not just stuck in Baptist and Methodist circles. We're still a very diverse group. And I would imagine our network of friends is very diverse as well. All right, let's get some closing remarks or comments from you. I mean, can you just speak into the camera, not to each other now, but if there's folks who are listening, let's say that they're Filipino American and they are Christian, but they're struggling to make sense of untangling their anti-blackness, their colonial mentality, and their Christian faith tied up with those things. What can you just say to them from your own experience or just in the moment, that has been valuable to you? I'm gonna go with EJ first because I've made him talk the least, but I know that he's already having to do this for a lot of folk. What would you say to some Filipino American Christians listening to this as your kind of last comment?
All right. Filipinos, I know as you navigate faith and Christianity, you get a little bit more woke on some social issues. I know Christianity might seem white, but I want to affirm you and, speak the truth that the gospel in Christ transcends whiteness. It transcends a European-centric model. And know that Jesus himself was a Jew. So, if you're struggling with how to untangle or disentangle all of that stuff, email me. I'm available to talk to you because I struggle with that too. I just want you to know that grace has no ethnic boundaries. Christ affirms your Filipino-ness. He affirms your confusion as you navigate your identity, and he's patient with you. And we get it. Us four get it. Get at us.
Wow, nice.
Can he just close for all of us?
No, I need to hear each of your voices.
Yeah, what EJ said. No, I'm just kidding. Well, for me, it is on a similar note. Just understand that, I believe that we all hit seasons where we will need to deconstruct. And I think it's important, as Filipinos to be surrounded by people with other experiences. I have benefited from hearing about experiences from my Black brothers and sisters, my white brothers and sisters, and my Hispanic brothers and sisters, and not just Christians, but of other faiths and of other views of life, and not to be intimidated by that. For me, if I really believe God is who God says he is, then I should not be intimidated by conversations with people who believe differently from me. And on a similar note again, if you are a Filipino and you are landing more on the more progressive side of theology, I don't claim to know all of the tenets of progressive Christianity, but I'm learning. And if you want to learn along with me, I can offer up my contact info and email, and we can have a conversation.
Good. I was offering the contact info.
Is it going to be under here? Is it going to be? Is going to be like a like, comment, and subscribe on the bottom?
Click the bell.
Something.
Can we do that? I guess, and I'm more speaking to just people who are kind of the same boat I'm in. Be brave, and to make sure that your conversations are filtered through the lens of Christ, and that it's like, don't react emotionally. And I speak as much to myself as anyone else, but just continue to learn. Don't be afraid, again, to have conversations, and seek out resources. And that has been huge for me. I have been recommending Jamar Tisby, The Color of Compromise, to everyone I know, because that was transformative. I post links to everything Jay writes, and it's very, and just, keep at it with conversations with first gen people, because your parents, your family, because even though that it seems like Filipinos are not capable of heart changes, God is bigger than that. And just be okay with the small victories along the way.
In addition to what they said, I think my pastoral comment for folks listening would be that, especially for Filipino Americans, given our history and our present challenges, we have to still find a way to go home. It's going to be difficult, and there will be countless reasons, especially pain, that would keep us from wanting to go home. But we have to go there. And we have to go there, but not stay there. We have to be able to face our story and our history so that we can go beyond just our own story and begin to live into the good news for all people. But thank you all for joining. I'm so happy for this conversation, and I hope that it will spark more. And I just want to close with this music so folks remember that they were part of this. We gotta dance a little bit.
Oh my goodness.